That's the hostess.
I first became friends with Alexander, who basically said, you must meet my mother.
Dress.
She went to Afghanistan, and then as I started delving into Pip, and was it 1972 that you set off and went basically every year after that. I had never met her, but a couple of years ago, I was in London and we made a date, and I was invited over and talk about Aladdin's cave with magic emanating from every room. And it was kind of, oh, let me see. Oh, can I try that on? But it was joyous. And you've all read the bio on Pip, so I do not have to say anything more. Alexander has volunteered to gently interview his mother. So carry on.
All right, I'll share. First of all, thank you all for coming. It's really lovely to see everyone and see some new faces. And Mum, thank you very much. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. So I'm going to share screen. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear us fairly clearly? Yeah. And Barbara, if you're still co-hosting, so if anyone else tries to join, you'll be able to admit them. Is that right?
They're late. Why should they get to come?
All right. Okay, no. So just one second.
Rau is the mother.
I know which one.
I already
getting there.
All right. Okay. So is the screen being
we remind everyone to mute.
On the screen right now.
Everyone should mute. Hit their mute button.
Right. So is the screen showing? Do you have the New York mirror from 1960 on your screens? Yes. You do? Good. All right.
Yes.
So, Mum, I would say you've always been fairly rebellious. Yes. You've had a kind of fairly independent outlook on life, and this is a photograph of you from the 1960s, perhaps from 1960. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your journey from, you know, kind of your own background, where you grew up and so on, to you being a collector and a dealer of textiles. But this seemed like a fairly good kind of starting point, because not only are you kind of defying the alert and you're being arrested, but you actually look like you're having quite a bit of fun. So would you say something about what this picture was about and where it was taken?
Yeah, it was taken, I think it was down in the village. I can't actually remember where it was taken. And it was, basically it was against the bomb, and everybody had to take cover. And I thought that was appalling, because I was very much against the bomb. And I'd been to Greenham Common and had always been not a member of CND, but very much a follower. And then I was in New York and there was this going on. So I went along and I got arrested. And I didn't know, I shouldn't fight back. I just should have sat there, but I did.
So there was actually, they had an alarm going and they wanted people to kind of, to act as they would, as if it was an actual bomb about to explode. So you were supposed to go and duck down and hide under a table, is that right?
That's right. And years later, I don't know if any of you knew Joe Gerina, but he remembered that day very well, because he was supposed to have he was in school, he was a lot younger than me, and he was supposed to get under the desk, and he refused, and I think he got expelled for that.
And what happened to you at the end after being arrested here?
I got a sentence. I was sentenced to 6 days in the Greenwich Village Women's House of Detention.
Right, so you owned your chops. Right, now let me get the... Okay, so that's a bit of a far journey from here, which obviously is quite a bit before you were born, but these were your grandparents. And the reason I'm showing this is because to say something about your background, which is quite a kind of traditional Jewish family, the kind of German Jewish family, right?
Right.
Right. So your dad actually was born in England, but from...
Yes, this is my mother's family.
Right, right. So you went from here to there. This was a photograph taken in your shop. Now the shop, for people who haven't visited it, was in Islington Green in North London, and it was really a kind of a jewel box of a shop. And you opened the shop in 1974, is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we'll actually get to that a little bit more. But just another photograph of your background. So this is you and your father, Fred. And you know, I'm kind of interested just in kind of the way we make decisions through life and how you can make one kind of fairly small decision and it completely changes your direction. You know, but often the decisions themselves are fairly small. But so you were born to a fairly kind of traditional family, Orthodox, well, not Orthodox, but traditional Jewish family.
Orthodox, but
yeah,
not.
yeah.
Not
So
extreme.
where was this photograph taken?
I think this was in Pinsgrove. That was just before the war, in 1939 probably, because we left in 1940 for Canada.
Right.
So I think this was in 1939 because I was already probably a year and a half or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And you did kind of inherit your love of travel, or you share a love of travel with
My father,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And adventure.
And adventure. Right, right. So I will say actually, it's kind of, I think it's quite important that your parents they were both dead by the time you were 19, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
My father died when I was 17, and my mother died a year and a half later.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a way, however hard that might have been, it actually in some ways could be seen as kind of allowing you to do what it made it probably easier for you to kind of develop your more kind of rebellious streak.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the photo on the left-hand side, there's the photo of the two women outside the door. That's outside the Beat Hotel.
I think it was actually maybe inside even.
All right. Okay.
Outside.
So that's most of you probably know the Beat Hotel, and the photo was actually taken in 1959, right?
Yeah.
So what were you doing there?
I was living there. I went there in 1958 and I left in 1959. So it was definitely 1950, and then went to the States. And I was living there and I joined the Beaux-Arts art school, but it was really bad. So I got all my students, everything there by joining up, and just went out and painted and drew and went to Le Grand Chaumière, which was much better, to do drawing, and had a good time.
And it wasn't the only art school you went to, was it?
No, it wasn't. No. I'd already been to three. I'd already been to three.
So altogether, what were the art schools that you went to?
I first went to St. Martin's, and then I went to Bezalel in Jerusalem, and then I went to Central, and then I went to Beaux-Arts in Paris, and then I ended up in California School of Fine Arts on Chestnut in San Francisco.
And do you remember some of your teachers at those art schools?
Yes, quite a lot of them. Yeah.
Who were you taught by? Who you might know?
Oliveira in San Francisco. Who else? Oh, and Anthony Caro at St. Martin's, and Elizabeth Frink, Bill Turnbull, Mervyn Peake. Who else taught me? Had Robert Adams. He was a marvelous sculptor.
Do you think that your parents would have kind of accepted your journey through art schools and so on? Because your brothers...
Well, education wasn't important as far as they were concerned for me, so that was fine. All my brothers had to go to university. One went to Oxford, the other went to Cambridge, and they went to the best school in London. But for me, it was totally unimportant. And I left school at 16.
Why was it not important for you?
Because I was a girl. And I was to marry well and be looked after, and that would be it, and maybe do some flower arranging or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always reasonably good at art, so that was a good place to send me. So I went to art school.
Right, right. So you, this photo was actually taken in Israel, right? This is with
Yeah.
the name. So
Yeah.
these are two friends. So, I mean, I should say that the chronology is going to be a little bit choppy, and I don't want to dwell too much on
I
that.
think that was the year that you were born.
1967. Uh-huh. And
Yeah.
you were painting furniture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you married my dad, Ili, and lived in Israel, and it was a nightmare.
Yeah.
And you escaped, literally escaped. When
Yeah.
my father was an actor, and at that time, for the woman to leave the country, you'd actually need the man's signature if there were children.
To take the children, yeah. To take the
Right. So
children.
you forged his signature
Mhm.
and basically left the country with me and my brother, with Yoram.
Mhm.
But so this was before. This is while you were still in Israel, and then you left. You left Israel, right?
Yeah.
So what did you do when you got to? What did you do when you got to England? I mean, or put it this way: how did it come about that you opened a shop? I mean, what was the?
Well, I had to earn money. I had to do something. I loved traveling. I loved shopping. And it seemed like a good idea. And I'd also had been collecting Palestinian dresses from 67.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back there. And then I went to Turkey and I bought a lot of kilims. And a friend of mine who had an African ethnographic shop, or was running it for her brother-in-law, found me a shop in Camden Passage. So that's where I started. And then I opened it in March 74. And I rented the top floor. There were 2 floors. And the top floor was run by a couple of people who had a shop in Portobello Road. Mark Jacobs and, I can't remember, Ian, somebody or other. And so they took it and they put somebody in the shop to sell for them upstairs. But sadly for them and for me, really, we really got into backgammon. And so we kind of ignored anybody who came into the shop because we were much too busy having backgammon matches every day. So they didn't last long. So they left after a year and I took over the upstairs as well.
Right, right.
So
and at that time, Camden Passage, which is where you were, was a very kind of busy place for antiques.
It was an antique market there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Did the shop, was it kind of successful from the beginning, or, I mean, you know, backgammon aside, was it?
Backgammon aside, I think after the backgammon went, somebody came into the shop. I think it was probably the following year. I think, sure, maybe they were even still there, but anyway, I was on my own in the shop.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew everything about everything and had traveled so much and was talking about himself. And I said, well, if you're so great, what can you do for me? And he said, would you like an article in the Times? And after that, we became great friends. He gave me a huge article with a picture, and that really set the shop off. And that really launched it more than anything.
And who was that man?
And that was Peter Hopkirk.
Right, right. So Soma, that was kind of interestingly, the talk last week was about manuscripts in relation to the Silk Road, and I saw Peter's name mentioned in the bibliography. So Peter actually really helped you. I didn't know that he was that kind of instrumental in getting the shop.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right, right.
And we remained great friends.
Yeah, yeah. So this actually is not a photograph of the shop. Unfortunately, I couldn't find all the photos I have, and you know, putting this together was really things that I had digital copies of. But I think kind of what's interesting is that your collection, the material you collected was quite kind of broad. Essentially kind of, you know, it was mainly Central Asian, kind of Afghan, Uzbek, Turkmen material. There was some Indian material, but your focus was really around Afghanistan and the.
Well, I fell in love with Afghanistan. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When did you first go?
In 1974, and I heard about Afghanistan from the guys upstairs. because they'd started their shop, and I couldn't go until they actually left the shop.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So what was the first trip? You went overland, right?
So I drove overland. Yeah.
And where did you get to?
That's actually in New York, that show. That was at TT's.
Yeah, for Ginsberg, yeah. So you got up to Herat, right?
We got as far as Herat. We went through Iran, through Turkey, and then back through Bulgaria, and back through Romania, and and Austria. Yeah.
What was Herat like?
Herat was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
There was absolutely nothing there. There was no food. There was big kebab and little kebab, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like going back 500 years. There were no cars on the street.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was any running water as far as I could remember. There were not many tourists around.
Uh-huh.
And it was just amazing. It was quite a different world. Very different from Iran.
Why did you stop in Herat rather than going on to Kabul?
I think Clive wanted to go back.
Uh-huh.
So that was why, yeah.
Well, that was
amazing.
The drive was amazing.
Yeah.
It would be quite hard to do an overland trip to Afghanistan right now, wouldn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Barbara, you're shaking your head. You're not up for that? Oh, you're still muted. So
I did it in '68, so
right.
I know what Pip went through. And I remember Herat vividly, and then across the desert and into Kabul and eventually into Nuristan. It was quite a trip.
Oh my, did you drive?
Uh-huh.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's amazing. Incredible story. Yeah. Nuristan really closed off. So
there was a magic about Afghanistan, didn't you find? That hadn't, nowhere else had it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is this Sufi Maku or is this Goofy Sufi?
That is Sufi Maku.
Sufi Maku.
Malam Maku.
Yeah, Malam Maku. So he's a teacher. So when I went with you to Kabul, what I found was that, your shop growing up obviously was it was a real jewel box and a kind of a treasure trove, and it was very quirky and normal. I suppose I was used to it, but it was kind of interesting going into these shops in Kabul, then later in Peshawar. I think this one probably is in Peshawar, but how similar they were to your shop, and it just seemed like, something of Chicken Street. Chicken Street was the main bazaar in Kabul, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right, and that's where all the dealers.
I wanted to have a shop there because I thought I'd do much better there than anywhere else.
If you opened a shop in Chicken Street. That would have been interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I would have turned out had that happened. Yeah, so, and then this is in Swat, the Swat Valley.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, I think one of the things, well, said a little bit about it later, but is that you really became friends with quite a lot of the dealers.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And how is that being a woman, in what was ostensibly a kind of?
Oh no, they just regarded me as a businessman. I wasn't a woman until I got to Peshawar. Then I was a woman. But in Afghanistan, they just treated me as a businessman, and I would eat with the men that the women didn't do, and that was fine.
Was that because they were just generally more liberal, or they were more kind of pragmatic about business, or both?
I think both. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, this is actually also in Peshawar. Quite a few of these pictures were from our trip. But what was kind of amazing about it is that you would go through piles and piles and piles of kilims and, and textiles and so on. And they would just kind of grow up, kind of mountains of them.
Yeah.
And there'd be a number of usually kind of young guys in the shop who would kind of lift things up and show them. And often you'd go, you'd like the thing right at the very bottom. well, one of the things I remember was that the trading, the buying, there's something so kind of enjoyable about it. So that even though I remember you would, it could have, I can't remember his name actually. But I remember actually in his shop, he would show something and you would argue over the price for half an hour, and kind of, back and forth, all in good spirits. And then you'd agree on a price. And then he'd pick up the next thing that might be almost as beautiful. And he'd say, this is a gift.
Yes.
And I was really kind of taken by the grace of people you were doing business with. There's something so kind of whimsical and enjoyable about it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was a whole program.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I
think that was probably in Tashkogan. That's in northern Afghanistan. It was either there or in Akcha, but I think that was Tashkogan.
Where is Akcha?
And Akcha is also northern Afghanistan. When I went up to Mazar-e-Sharif, which is in the north, Akcha is close to there. And then on the drive back to Kabul, we went through Tashkogan, where many of the Tajik dealers that I knew had come from there.
Mm-hmm. Did you find there were kind of very different experiences dealing with the Tajiks to the Pashtuns to the local Kabuli dealers or people from Mazar-e-Sharif? Were there kind of
yeah, I suppose, but I think they each had their own personality.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, yes, I think I preferred the actual Afghan ones to the Pashtun ones.
Right.
Yeah, generally.
Yeah.
Kausha.
This is a guy called Kausha, and maybe you could say something about how he, about him, because he became a very, very significant dealer who always had the most astonishing material. But he grew up came from quite a kind of humble background, didn't he?
His father was a cobbler, and they were very, very poor, and the shop was filthy when I first went there. Most of the shops were pretty damn filthy in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a small shop there in Chicken Street. He didn't get wealthy until he moved to Peshawar with his brother. The whole family made a lot of money, and then he changed completely. And the cobbler, the father, was always sitting in the doorway and always asking him to please bring down the price for me and make it better for me and to be nicer to me and to not to charge so much. So and I had a very good relationship with him, and I got some marvelous stuff from him. He had only one eye, but it was a bloody good eye. Because the other one was completely blind.
Right.
Well, he had terrible squints, but he could. I don't know, but he.
I remember that. Yeah.
Whatever it was, he had.
He wasn't very popular, was he?
No, it was his brother who was really unpopular more than him.
Right,
but he was, they're very tribal.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of kind of jealousy.
The whole of the brothers, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a clan.
Yeah. So you would have got, so he had really good material. I mean, how would someone go about just getting the best material? I mean, obviously he had a good eye.
He had a very good eye, and people would bring things into town. They'd bring things from Amu Darya, from Bukhara, and from Uzbekistan, and they would just bring them over their shoulders. They'd somehow walk and ride donkeys, and however they came. Yeah. And they'd take buses, I guess. And then a lot of them came from over the border and came from different regions of Afghanistan. Carpets came from Maimana, which is also in the northwest of Afghanistan. Things came from Herat. They came from all over because the big market was in Kabul.
Right.
And those two were great guys, and they were really fun.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was that, again, it's kind of connected to your pleasure in dealing and buying material. Well, actually, you generally said that you preferred buying to selling. But
Always.
you had some really great relationships with people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guy on the right was wonderful. He was an Uzbek, and he was actually murdered by his nephew. It was a horrendous thing. The nephew wanted to borrow money, and he wouldn't give it, and that was the end of him.
Mm.
But he was a wonderful guy, tremendous. Everybody loved him, and
Mhm.
he had very, very good carpets. He was a carpet dealer, and the one on the left was Ghulam Gul, and he was a Turkmen jewelry dealer, or all sorts of jewelry, but mostly Turkmen.
Mhm.
And he had very, very good things. And he actually moved later on to Peshawar,
Right.
and his nephew took over from him then.
And they both had a bit of a kind of
And they were both alcoholic.
They like to drink. Right.
Totally alcoholic.
Right. Would that have been kind of fairly common in Kabul at that time?
Amongst some of them, not the Pashtun. I don't know any Pashtuns who drank.
Really?
But yeah, I don't think I knew.
Yeah.
They certainly didn't, these two.
These two, right.
Absolutely not. No, they were very religious. In
Yeah.
fact, the one on the left, I remember his son got married and he didn't meet his wife till a week after the wedding.
The son didn't? Wow.
I know, it was all very bizarre.
Yeah. But they were brothers, right? So it's
They were brothers, and he was a
Malamud,
teacher, the one on the left.
and then his older brother,
And his older brother.
who we used to call Goofy Sufi. And they just had an incredible sense of humor. They were just laughing.
They were Pashtun, they were from Ghazni.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they were always laughing, and they were very nice guys. They still are, as far as I know. Yeah. Very nice.
So one of the things that we used to do, and I'm sure this happened a lot when you would go to Kabul, was that, I mean, we were being a bit strategic, but you kind of taught me that there was, if you visited people at a certain time, you'd get invited for lunch, and some people had better lunches than others. But there were some people who would only invite you kind of 1 or 2 days ahead of time rather than there and then, because they would provide these incredible spreads. So, we'd go in and they would just bring out dozens of dishes that were prepared at home and they would bring into the shop. So we would eat, I mean, sometimes it was kebab, which was fantastic as well, but this was kind of fairly typical, right? That you'd have these amazing meals provided for you.
Oh, yes. Every day I went somewhere else for lunch, and the women at home would cook the day before and that day, and we'd have loads and loads of different dishes. And the food was very different from the different tribes. This is Pashtun. And we had amazing Afghan food as well, that you probably remember.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, the guy we saw before, Kausha, the food at his place. I'm only dwelling on the food because I have heard quite a few of the people on this in the salon express quite a strong interest in food. So I'm just bringing that into the mix.
Oh, the food is fantastic. It's a lot of work to prepare, but it's
right.
And what I found so fantastic is I loved the food in Afghanistan. I hated the food in Central Asia. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why there should be such a difference.
I think Persia probably has quite a lot to do with it.
Probably.
Yeah, I think the cuisine from Iran, which is just fantastic, kind of had a lot of influence certainly in Kabul.
The mantu and yes, probably a lot of the dishes were Persian.
Yeah.
And there were women who cooked it.
Right. Yes. Speaking of the women, you're very lucky because as a traveler, you would obviously, or as a businesswoman, and as a very kind of personable human being, you were kind of accepted by the men, but you also were able to meet with women too, which I would never have been allowed to.
Yeah, I mean, I stayed in their house. That was in Swat,
mm-hmm.
on several occasions. And then I would always go and see the women, and their quarters were totally separate. They never ate together. They never ate with the men, even when there weren't visitors. It was always completely separate.
Yeah. And this was kind of a mixture between kind of Islamic law, but also even in a way even more so it was tribal law, right? So the Pashtuns were incredibly traditional and kind of you know, the idea of kind of honor was kind of really quite excessive. So I knew this family quite well, and I you know, I spent a lot of time with them when I was in SWAT, but I never met the women, even the mother, who's the one.
Yeah, well, they would have covered their faces anyway. If any man would come into their environment, they would immediately cover up.
Yeah, yeah. Right. So actually, the man on the right is Jambaz Khan, who became a very, very close friend, and he was the son of the woman. No, oh no, hang on. Oh, I don't know how to go back. Oh well, never mind. How do I go back? Maybe this. Yes, there we go. So I'm putting this photo with two pictures from the guest book that we had at home growing up, right? So when we were in Belfast Park, we had a guest book because we had visitors coming in from all over the place. I mean, a lot of people from Afghanistan. Can you tell the story of when Jambaz first appeared?
Jambaz first appeared. Jambaz rang me up from London Airport, and I'd never met him. And that was, I think, 1983, I think. And he'd been staying with Andy and Kate in Topanga in Los Angeles. And he rang up from the airport and said, Nancy, who was another friend, said I could come and stay with you. So I said, oh, well, okay. I knew of him, but I've never met him. So he took a taxi and came to the shop, and then he came home, and he sort of stayed for 18 years until finally I threw him out. But he didn't stay all the time, but often I'd get phone calls in the middle of the night from Japan and all sorts of places. Is this Jambaz's house? So finally I had enough of it. But yeah, that was Jambaz. Anyway, he's doing fine, and he came to see me last week.
He's incredibly handsome, isn't he, in this picture?
Yes. Yeah.
He told me a story that he had been given his father. He's a Pashtun, and his father had a shop in Chicken Street. And when Jambaz was 12, the father said, you know, I want to go back to the village. I want to be in the garden to eat grapes. And he gave the shop to Jambaz, and Jambaz basically had to kind of fend for himself. And at that time, there were quite a lot of tourists or people living in Afghanistan. It was before the Mujahideen, before the Russian invasion. And he told me the story of getting chased by, I think, by a lady diplomat who really took to him quite strongly. And he said he was kind of running around the table, and she was kind of chasing him, which I really kind of liked that story. But he's kind of built up a kind of bit of an empire with, I mean, and he actually didn't have any passion for the material though, right? And he really saw it as a commodity. I mean, he didn't care much about the quality of.
Yes, but he learned a lot about it. He really did learn about, he really does know a lot about antiquity. I don't think he knows that much about textiles.
Yeah.
But the things that he made money on, he really learned about, and he really did know.
Yeah, yeah. But he would be just as happy dealing in Afghan socks as he would in lacquer embroidery.
Yes, possibly he would. I think now he's a bit more refined, but I mean, socks were a big business.
Yeah. The guy on the far left, on the other hand, was
Ismatullah Makhdoom. He was a marvelous guy, and he came from, I think he came from Anhoy, also or maybe it was Akcha, but also in the north of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Uzbek. And he really had marvelous pieces. He didn't have a big shop, and didn't have many pieces, but what they were choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody was keen, because everybody would go in the summer, all the dealers would be there. So it was always a race to get to them when they got a new shipment in, or when somebody had come into town, and to get there first and get first pickings.
Right, right.
So,
and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the ECATs, because you've got a good you,
where they make guns.
Nara, right, right. So this was very close to Landi Qatar, which was the main kind of hashish production.
On the
center.
Khyber Pass, yeah.
Yeah, in the Khyber Pass. So this was kind of like a legal no man's land, wasn't it? I mean,
It was no man's land, yeah.
Yeah. So it's where
there were warlords. It was their land. It was all run by warlords.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, did you buy that gun?
No, I didn't.
This was in
Vandermeer, near
Vandermeer.
Tonian. Yeah.
Right, right.
Amazing. Did you go there, Barbara?
No, I didn't, and I regret it, but
It was just beautiful, yeah.
once on a pass on the way up, a gorgeous horse and rider.
Mm.
I mean, I can still see his turban flowing.
Yeah.
And I mean, the images we were lucky enough to experience. No, I did not get to the lakes, much regret.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the light was so wonderful all over Afghanistan, like nowhere else. The light was just amazing.
And the style. I mean, these guys look so cool. Their outfits are just. Was that what happened?
That was the man I undressed.
Well, which one?
I think he was the one. I think he was the one on the left because he had the trousers on as well that I really needed, and he had the top and the waistcoat. He had the whole caboodle. So that was a Turkoman outfit. It was brown corduroy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never seen it before. And it was just worn by, it was Turkoman, and it was just those people who wore it, and they were from the villages. And I was just completely stunned by it. And then I got somebody to start collecting. But mostly I didn't get many more trousers. I think maybe I just got another 2 pairs. I got waistcoats and I got a lot of the tops.
Yeah.
And I still have some. And you used to wear one.
I did.
They were great. Yeah. They were all brown corduroy.
Yeah.
And it was the most elegant 3-piece suit I've ever seen.
Right. Yeah, they really did look so, there's something
it's so stylish.
So well, yeah. So this we think could either be, it could be in Mangora, in Swat, or in
Peshawar.
Yeah.
I think it was
it's kind of interesting that we'd often see carpets being hung out, and sometimes they were actually on the road itself. Basically, that was one way of
aging them.
Older. Yeah, they'd get antiquated by having kind of traffic driving over them, and camels and dung and what have you. So it is quite hard to age or to date quite a lot of the material. Yeah, I don't actually know why this image is here, because this could be in Turkey, but
it was on my first visit, because I can see I'm sleeveless, and I was never sleeveless in Afghanistan. I think it was Turkey. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. You look like you're kind of holding your own there. But...
Yeah. Yeah, I like that photograph.
Mm.
And that was definitely Kabul.
That's in Kabul, yeah. So these are kind of basically almost like ambient photos, just to give you an idea of the feel of the place. So, Mum, you started going in 1974, and then how often would you go? I mean, you'd go.
And then I'd go mostly once a year, occasionally twice a year. Yeah, mostly in the summer when I could pack you and your brother off to Israel, to your father. And I'd have 6 weeks of freedom and I'd be off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What we missed, yeah.
Yeah. And that was Akcha. I remember that.
Yeah.
That's up in the north again, and it's very primitive and wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
When was the Soviet invasion? Was it in 79?
That was in 79, yep. I was there, yeah.
You were there when it happened?
I was there in December, yeah.
When
they rolled in.
So you basically kind of had 5 years of kind of Soviet-free, Mujahideen-free experience being in Kabul, and then how? I mean, obviously it changed unimaginably, but
Yes.
how did it change? I mean, say in Kabul, how was it different?
Well, I mean, then there was curfew, and then it was pretty dangerous, but it was all a little bit Mickey Mouse. You couldn't really take it very seriously because of where you were, although it was pretty serious.
Mhm.
But yeah, it did change. It changed a lot. And people, I mean, Europeans and other people didn't go so much. Tourists didn't come.
Mhm. Mhm. And how? I mean, one of the issues was that nobody knew who to trust, right? Because
Exactly,
one of the
exactly.
ways,
Even within families. I mean, already there were two, the Afghans themselves were split into two, both pro-Russian, but very different parties.
Mhm.
I can't remember what they were both called now.
There was Khalki. Well, I remember there were two secret services.
Halki was one.
Yeah, and then Khalni or something. They sounded quite similar, but they were. I think they both had their own kind of secret police.
Yeah. And then at first it was Turaki. Then I think he got killed. Then it was, who was that guy? Who I can't remember the name of the next guy.
Yeah. Can you talk about the synagogue in Kabul?
Yes. It was, well, by the time I went quite a few times, but then when I went, I think it was probably in 2002, and there were only two Jews there still. One was Ashkenaz and one was Sephardi. So one was from, I think one was from Herat, and the other one was, I can't remember where he was from. Maybe he was from Kabul. He was the older one, and the Herati was the younger one. And the older one actually had sent his family out. They were both taken by the Mujahideen, or by the, I think it was by the Mujahideen then. And they were forced to convert to Islam. But the younger one refused, and the older one converted. I mean, he didn't have to do anything physical, luckily, because that had already been done. Mm-hmm. But they never spoke again after that, but they were both living in the synagogue when I met them, and I tried to make peace, but I heard both the stories, because I could actually talk Hebrew with one of them. The younger one talked Hebrew. And of course, he couldn't find a wife anymore because there were no Jews left. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that he eventually also left for Israel. And the older one did. But they were all right. I mean, they stayed more or less in the synagogue. Mm-hmm. But they were treated okay.
But there had been quite an active
Jewish community in
Kabul.
Yeah. And there had been a very large Jewish community there. Mm-hmm. But most of them did leave for Israel. Yeah.
Right. So we did a trip in Soviet Central Asia to Turkmenistan and to Uzbekistan, and we went to quite a lot of the synagogues there. Right, that was part of your itinerary to go to synagogues in Samarkand and Bukhara.
Yeah. And to give prayer books for my brother, because my brother was, I think he was in touch with a lot of the communities. Uh-huh. And so I think we gave them Sidurim.
Right. Yeah. So that was your interest in kind of the Jewish communities, was partly just your background and your kind of identification in that way, even though it wasn't a kind of it wasn't a kind of religious thing, but it was more kind of a cultural interest, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
That's me being stylish. Crossing into Afghanistan when I
you look beautiful. Such lovely ankles. So where will you go?
Telltale. I was going from Kabul to Jalalabad.
And why were you wearing a chadri?
Because tourists were not allowed to go there. They weren't allowed into Afghanistan then, and certainly not over the Khyber.
Right. So you think that nobody knew that you were a tourist?
Well, hopefully nobody looked. No, I was with Afghans. And I guess my feet were a giveaway. But there you go.
Yeah. It's a great photo. I really like that. And actually, were you going to Jalalabad then?
I was going to Jalalabad, yeah.
Okay. So, we've done quite a bit of traveling. This was a trip to up to Karakoram towards Kashgar, right? So I think this was still on the Pakistani side of the, God, I can't remember the name of the pass, but
The Karakoram.
the Karakoram, yeah, but the pass, I think it was Sust.
Sust was the name of the town, I think, at the border.
Yeah. So having gone to Afghanistan, you did quite a bit of traveling, again to Pakistan and then to northwest China to Xinjiang province. So what was going on here?
Well, that was with you. You were there. And I was trying to get onto the donkey. I think the lorry or the bus or whatever we were on had broken down.
Uh-huh.
There was no other way of going. So that's Yoram, that's your brother.
No, that isn't. That's Tarek. But I just can't imagine that I wasn't helping you. That's just unforgivable.
Oh, that's not Yoram. Who is it?
No, Tarek, a guy we met traveling. Yeah.
Oh, my. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
But
that was all rather funny. So
yeah.
it was.
And then this was on the, I think this was on the Chinese.
Yeah, that was just amazing. All those symbols.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
So this is kind of going into talking a little bit about your collection. I put this photo in just because I kind of love the relationship. Now, you know, the symbolism is something that actually we talked about Andy Hale and Kate Fitzgibbon. They would be kind of much more interested, well, they were kind of much more academic in their interests. So the whole kind of symbolism or the process of making the material was not your primary concern, right? I mean, you were really interested in the kind of the formal, the kind of artistic.
It was the visuals of it.
The visual side.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it was still kind of really interesting just seeing the way some of these images kind of appeared in different kind of locations.
Yeah.
So we'll get to the cats later, but I'll just show some of the photos of your collections of purses. So this is a Turkmen purse, right?
Maimana.
This is Maimana. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh.
And that's Teki, Turkmen.
Oh, so beautiful. Almost look like pearls, but and would these presumably have been made either as part of a dowry? But when you see these things, you look at the needlework and you feel the eye as a muscle, kind of looking at, picking up some of the details. It's almost like miniature painting, but with needlework, and it's just so astonishing. The kind of
another techie one.
The finesse and the detail, and the designs themselves were just incredible. I don't know whether these would have been drawn out ahead of time, but just kind of the idea of coming up with this imagery and how pieces often seem so balanced. And I'm sure they weren't drawn out in color. Well, I'm not sure, but I imagine they weren't drawn out in color. Do you remember buying most of these pieces? Or
yeah, I do.
Yeah,
that's very fine.
Mm-hmm.
But that's Pashtun. Yeah.
That's Pashtun.
Yeah.
And the Hazara had.
Yeah.
Is that needlework? Sorry to interrupt.
It is very, very, very fine needlework.
Wow. It just looks like a print. It's incredible.
It does.
So all that black, the little lines of black, that would be black needlework between each of the rhombus shapes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's not much black in there though.
With
no. So that black will be needlework as well.
Yes, everything is needlework. Absolutely. Everything. Yeah.
And this would be about 5 or 6 inches tall. You know,
Yeah, quite.
and it would be it's a purse, right? It's
Yeah, the purse.
kind
Yeah.
of like I just think the balance of colors, and also, I mean, I don't know how old this is, but maybe 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, probably around about.
How modern it is. You know, if you think about, you know, kind of American painting or European painting in the 1920s, and this would have been part of a tradition that obviously predated that, possibly by centuries. So I think Barbara Rubin was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, just kind of these ideas about abstraction being a Western invention, which obviously, you know, it's not. But I just think there's something about the kind of the arrangements of colors and were just really astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
And who made these? Women, men?
The women. I think the women did mostly the purses.
Mm-hmm. The lacquer embroidery, which I think were actually more by the men, but I think these were women. So, you know, halfway down, you see these images that look like they could be chickens or...
Chickens. Yeah, they are chickens.
Yeah, they are chickens, yeah. But often I remember Andy would say that we often kind of want to find symbolism, and he thought that they were often really just shapes that had evolved and just became part of the kind of lexicography. But again, the colors are just amazing.
That's baluch. That's beautiful.
Is it not Katwas?
No, it's baluch.
It's just mad.
What size is that?
Sorry?
What size is that?
Well, I should think it's about 8 inches top to bottom.
That's unbelievably fine.
Yeah, very, very fine. And then all of the little twirly bits, that's all done by hand as well. The sort of strings with the pom-poms attached to them.
It's like a binding, right?
The work that goes into that is extraordinary.
Yeah, just insane. You know, it's kind of interesting for me is that when you had the shop, you just really kind of piled everything in there, you know, and kind of things were kind of overlaid. And that was kind of, it was a kind of a maximalist aesthetic. But there were other people who would show these, and they would really kind of turn them each into an art object. You know, I mean, someone like Clive Lovelace would show work, and you know, you know, I think both have their benefits, but it's also, I mean, you know, it's kind of a funny thing to say, but when you sold these, they were incredibly inexpensive. It seemed to me, considering
that
how much.
Particular hat, that would not be inexpensive.
Oh, good. But the purses, you know, you'd sell them for like £50 or £100, and you wouldn't get you wouldn't get a contemporary painting for that. So it's kind of an odd, you know, the economy is quite an odd one, and I think it's possibly partly to do with things being associated with maybe because they were women's work.
This is an ongoing dialogue in the art world, particularly about what is craft and what is fine art.
Yeah.
And craft has always, sadly, been demeaned as not being high art until probably within the last few decades.
Yeah.
But and so that's probably explains why the prices would have seemed low to you, Alexander.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, this is a little bit blurred, but just
Could you go back one?
Kind
of ran over the last one. What is that?
That's Turkmen. I think it's a bridal hat because there's some feathers, the residue of feathers, and that would be for fertility.
Oh, right. Wow.
So you'd have little chicks.
Fabulous object.
Would there be a turban? So there wouldn't be a turban wrapped around the narrower part of that?
No, they would have jewellery.
Oh, they'd have jewellery. Right.
Jewellery.
Right,
Yeah.
right. There's some fantastic books on Turkmen. Well, Barbara would know quite a lot about this, about the kind of publication.
I was about to say I have just the thing for it. So.
Yeah. Again, you know, just kind of, this is from SWAT, right?
That's, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's Kohistan. Yeah.
From Khorasan, right. And again, the needlework on that is
Is
so
phenomenal.
fun, you know?
Yeah.
And then they'd stick these kind of massive kind of buttons, sometimes plastic buttons, and that's actually a zipper around the edge. You know, and I just love that combination of
And
kind of,
coins and buttons.
right.
And things.
Mhm. Oh. Yeah. We have a rule never to laugh in our household because it's, you know, it's bad for the skin. So so these are some of your collections, and they have proved kind of useful to some of the people in your family for dressing up over the years. So probably your secondary collection was of lacquer embroideries.
Mm-hmm.
And these, I think, were made by the men, I think.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
Again, we've kind of referred quite a bit to Andy Hale and Kate Fitzgibbon, who are a couple who, Andy used to live in Afghanistan, and they learned Russian. I think they also learned
Uzbek,
Uzbek.
and a lot of the Turkic languages.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
So they've done quite a lot of research about this, and of course the e-cuts. But I think he said, I think there were references here to pomegranates.
He wrote a book about them.
About lacquer, yeah, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. So the
these works are made. This one before this image and this image. These were made by men.
I think so. The story that I remember, and I might not have the facts right, was that the Lakai were a semi-nomadic Uzbek tribe. And I think what had happened was that when the patriarch died, he bequeathed his possessions to, I think, 7 of his 8 sons, and he'd basically forgotten about the 8th. And then his last words were the 8th son, just take what you need from your brothers. And they became, they were quite literal about it, and they became kind of bandits. I mean, I really might be making this up, but as I remember it, the Lakai became bandits and were kind of feared.
They were feared.
But they made these kind of unbelievable textiles and textiles and embroideries.
They're wonderful. I was just thinking, and this is probably very I'm being stereotyping, and I shouldn't as an art historian, but the images, the actual symbols themselves are really powerful, but the needlework doesn't seem as fine as we saw in the women's work.
Actually, I think,
or maybe it could be the slide. I don't know.
It's not a great slide. And also these are slightly bigger, but the needlework is really phenomenal in these. I think they use something called the mochi stitch, or the shoemaker's stitch.
Ah, okay, then I'm wrong.
I think probably you're right. Actually, with some of those purses, they really kind of almost hard to see the needle.
It's almost getting to look like a Suzanne there, isn't it?
Yes, well, Suzanne is just really the generic word for embroidery. So they are, yeah.
But
Alexander, could you spell Lakai? I don't know that word.
Yeah, it's Lakai.
Thank you.
And if you were to look it up with the name, alongside the name Andy Hale, Hale, or Kate Fitzgibbon, you'll come across one of their books. And they also wrote a very, very good article in Harley about Lakai.
Yes, and I sold 50 of those to the British Museum, and Kate came and lectured about them.
Right.
And then I gave a talk about them as well, because they are actually shown once in the storage.
Right. This is a slightly sensitive topic, but your second most prominent collection after ECATS was of Lakai embroideries, and they bought a very, very significant collection. And of course, what happens with English museums, and probably less so in America, because storage and funding is so low, they were shown briefly, but they've essentially been in storage for most of this time, and it's really a shame.
I've found that people who are giving significant gifts now really write into the gift agreement that the works have to be shown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, again, looking at these, thinking about Miro's work, and kind of early Paul Klee, and again, it's slightly spurious in some respects, but I just, even Keith Haring, particularly actually in these. This actually, Mum, is not one of yours.
That's Katawas.
That's Katawas. This isn't one of yours because the images I have are not good as the Katawas. This is a bicycle seat.
Yeah.
Ah,
I mean, really, to make a bicycle seat like that is
Fantastic.
yeah.
The idea that everything can be embellished is such a wonderful concept.
Yes, yeah, that's really true. So there you can see some of the needlework. Again, it's really something else. Mum, what was this?
That's a yahan. It's from a Turkmen robe.
So it'd be like the board, the ending.
It goes round the.
Yeah. It's incredible colours.
And that's the back of a hat.
So that would go over the ponytail, or?
Yeah, that would hang down the back.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's Kyrgyz.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Kyrgyzstan.
There's some interesting stories. I can't remember the name of the particular tribe, but there's it might be folkloric of Alexander the Great when he kind of moved east. He got as far as this area, as this part of what's now Pakistan, kind of northern Pakistan. And so when you look at Gandharan sculpture, there's obviously connections between kind of Greco and Indian carving. But there's a tribe called, do you remember, Mum, the name of the tribe that was supposed to be related to, he'd left one garrison behind. And so they still have these dances that are very, very similar to Greek dances.
Ah, yeah.
In that tribe? I can't remember. It'll come to me later.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of like dervishes.
Yeah, they would interlock arms and move from side to side. I'll find it later.
There was an exhibition at LACMA that I have a catalogue of them.
Uh-huh. I have a feeling Penelope would beat me to the information, but yes.
You mentioned Alexander the Great in Siwa Oasis, which is one of the most isolated oases in Egypt, right over towards the Libyan border. I don't even think you can go there now. I think it's much more difficult to get to. But they have. I've got a bridal veil that I got from there in the very early 90s, and that bridal veil had, amongst lots of other patterns on it, had an 8-pointed star on it. And when I asked about that, they said, "Oh, Iskandar, Alexander," because by tradition, Alexander visited Siwa Oasis before he moved on to that eastern campaign in 333 BC to consult the oracle of Siwa as to whether he was divine or not. And we don't know what the response of the oracle was, but isn't that just incredible that from 333 BC through to the 1990s, they are still so powerful as the oral collective memory of that small oasis, that they're still making things with a reference to Alexander of Macedon, his 8-pointed star, and still know why they're making it.
Incredible. Yeah. Wonderful.
would that be the Kalash tribe?
Thank you. I think I said, I don't know if it was heard, but I did say just now, I bet Penelope will beat me to the information.
Sorry, it's a bad habit.
It's a fantastic habit. It's one that I appreciate. Mum, your collecting actually started with Palestinian dresses, right? So you still have a
Palestinian one.
Collection of Palestinian dresses. So actually, possibly in Egypt, they would have worn something fairly similar.
I think there might be some that are from the Sinai.
Right.
Would have been.
So we're now going to go, and I hope this isn't going too long. This has been, all right, I'm going to speed up a little bit. I'm sorry, this is, so this is another of your collections of Russian enameled mirrors, or mirror covers, right? So that's actually a door that will open in the middle, and you think it might be made for the Afghan market?
I think so. Made in Russia. I mean, it's pressed metal and then enamel painted on top.
Right.
How big are these?
They're about
What's the
12 inches.
They're very thin. They're very thin.
About 12 inches tall.
How big or how thick?
How
Big.
Big dimensions.
Oh, dimensions. I have different sizes. I have some that are much bigger.
And
But
when were
generally,
they made?
a foot by 9 inches.
When were those doors, mirrors?
Oh, I think they're 19th century. They're probably late 19th century.
They're really beautiful because they're kind of like Art Nouveau, you know, ish. They've got very beautiful flowing lines. So maybe they're late 19th century.
I think they're late 19th century.
Mum, when did you first start collecting ECATs, and how did that come about? That you?
Because I've been to so many art schools, I just thought of them as the most amazing art form and sort of as good as any painting, certainly. And I think probably 76 already.
Mm-hmm.
I started, yeah.
And you got one collection from?
And I got one brilliant collection from Raouf, yeah.
From Raouf.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was 79. When I went with Simon. I think that was the time. With Simon? Well, I flew to Peshawar with Simon I met him in Simon Winchester, yeah.
Oh, so he was there when you bought your first collection?
No, he didn't go with me to Afghanistan.
Okay.
But we went up to Peshawar together. We went to Pindi and then to Peshawar, and then I flew from Peshawar into Kabul.
Right. So this is dated 1900. Crying out loud. Isn't that incredible?
It's modern.
It is so
absolutely.
modern. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I just wouldn't think of putting those colors together. But it's strange, I think if you were putting the colors together with paint, there's something about the weaving, and the texture that really adds something to the piece. So this is how
Matisse collected textiles.
Sorry?
Matisse collected textiles.
And Kandinsky too.
Kandinsky, yeah.
Yeah, and Paul Klee. I think Paul Klee had African textiles. So it's kind of nice to see how they might have been worn, between there and there. So we've moved on from your various collections to your home, which is also quite a big focus of your energy. And what I love about your home is that it really is centered around the kitchen. So Clive, who was the first, your partner, your boyfriend, who you first traveled to Afghanistan with, was an amazing builder, putter together, finder, and it was a time when styles were changing in England. So a lot of what he built the house out of were things that were found or being sold fairly inexpensively. So those are the Russian mirrors.
Okay. Yeah. Their sense of scale.
Mm-hmm. Mum, say something about that ECAT in the corner, the red and yellow one.
My favorite one, the red one at the back.
Yeah.
It's very, very early, and it's just I did teach. The only job I ever had was teaching basic design, and I just find you can't really see it on that photograph, but it's just a real lesson in basic design, and I just love it. I mean, it's just completely I think that's, if the house was on fire, that's certainly one of the 3 things I would take.
Wow. And it's kind of interesting, the ECATs were often valued according to how many colors they would have, right?
Yeah, and that has 2. Yeah.
That has 2. So it's kind of a simpler one. But the Afghani were is that the 7 colors? Afghani?
Afghani is 7 colors, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So those were the most kind of sophisticated and complex ones. But actually, often you kind of gravitated towards that were simpler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And years ago, I used to sell them to Japanese dealers who would throw away the ECATs. They would buy them for the linings because they were those beautiful Russian linings on the back.
Right.
And they had no interest whatsoever in the ECAT. So they would just buy them for the linings.
There's another one.
That's
so
another
the shop has now moved to your home, you know,
Yes.
when you close your shop. I will say that you had the shop for 40 years and then decided to close it. And I was there on the last day. You locked the door, pulled down the grill, locked that, walked away, and you literally didn't look back.
Nope, not once.
You know, and it kind of literally and metaphorically. So something that was such a big part of your life, your social life.
Yeah, it was my social life, absolutely. And I loved the shop. But it was getting, I mean, there were less good things to find. There was not that much interest anymore. I don't know. And the whole of the passage was changing. It's
Camden Passage.
Yeah, it was changing so much.
Yeah.
And I have this very large room in my house that I wasn't really using. So it sort of seemed a sensible idea to transfer it.
Yeah. And then this is, we mentioned Jambaz Khan earlier on, who was the Pashtun in Kabul, who actually now lives in New Jersey. But he found this house for you. It was actually a shop, is that right?
No, it was a house, and it was brought to Germany 8 years. It had been lying in Germany for 8 years. It was supposed to have gone to a museum. And I don't know what happened. But anyway, I said to him that I wanted some carved wood because I needed to build a shed in the garden. And he said, well, I've got a house. So I said, okay, I'll buy the house. So I bought the house. But it came like an IKEA flat pack, and it was very, very difficult to work it out because it was just panels, basically.
Yeah.
Very long.
Is it Nuristani?
It's from Nuristan.
Yeah, that's what you said. Yeah.
It's from Nuristan, yes. Yeah, so it was high up in the mountains, and the bottom part would have been boulders, and the animals would have lived in the bottom, and the family would live upstairs with the carved part, and the warmth would come up from the heat of the animals below.
All right, so just winding down, Mum, thank you. You know, it's funny, I was thinking about your parents and your brothers who moved to Israel and lived there kind of fairly, you know, they were much more or much less rebellious than you are. They didn't leave religion in the way that you kind of deviated a little bit. So this actually is a photograph of my cousins. And I just kind of find it amazing that had you not have made some of the decisions that you made, that could be me.
Which one?
Probably the one in the middle in the dress. No, the guy in the beard, the patriarch, who's now is basically 2 or 3 years older than me, right?
Yeah, your first cousin. Yeah.
So you know, I don't want to kind of minimize this at all because it's, you know, but it's kind of, I just find it amazing that, you know, had you have followed your brothers to Israel and had you have been slightly less rebellious than you were, then this wouldn't have happened, and neither would this. Mum, thank you very much. It's been really, really nice talking to you and hearing all this. And I'm going to end the share.
Pip, question.
Wow. Yes,
I mean, it's joyous. One of the things I found interesting in the early pictures in the Afghan shops with all the pattern, I was thinking that's how Alexander paints.
yeah.
And it's kind of a feeling of early influences on him, and I don't know if I'm accurate.
I think you are. Well, you should ask him, but I think that.
Well, I'm asking his mother first, Alexander.
Yeah, no, because he was brought up with all of this around him.
Yeah, but he could have gone minimal, and he went delightfully excessive, which
Yeah,
I love.
yeah.
What's your feeling, Alexander?
You know, I remember as a very, very young child just kind of looking at patterns, which I think all children do, or many children do. They get absorbed by patterns. And I don't know what's happening psychologically, but whether you're trying to kind of find the connections. But I would really get very, very absorbed by them. But I think it's not just the aesthetics. I think it's also just the kind of the quirkiness of, and I think in a way the social aspect and the relational aspects of my mother's and the way she connected to people, because she never really separated me and my brother Yoram from her kind of her group of people. We were just kind of accepted, and in a way this is generational. That parents seem to kind of focus more on their children now than they did with when I was a kid, which I think it was more kind of through osmosis rather than the kind of very particular, conscious decision. It's just that material was around me all the time.
I've got a question for Pip. Can I fire it at you, Pip?
Pardon?
Can I fire a question at you?
Certainly.
I don't know whether you've ever come across him. There's a dealer in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul called Nabil Bismachi. He's one of the last great dealers in the bazaar. And he spent 30 years of his life traveling all over Turkey, into Iran, but not really Afghanistan. But now he no longer does it, and nor to his children. And when I recently asked him about it, he said, it's pretty much all gone.
Yep.
It's all been sold. It's with collections. He said it'll all come back again because those people who have collected it, they'll pass it on to their children will put it back into the market. It's a generational thing. But he said there's just nothing, more or less nothing more out there. Is that the case?
That's absolutely the case, because Ismatullah, who you saw before, who had just the best things, he came to see me recently and he took pictures of my stuff. He said there's nothing left, absolutely nothing. So, and I've also had people coming to me who have traveled all over and not found anything and have come to me.
Right.
To what do you attribute that?
My greed.
To what do you attribute the fact that this has disappeared?
I think
what phenomenon?
It's a supply and demand. I mean, when it worked for me, it was because other people were doing it as well. But then people lost, and then the collectors are dying out. They're just not interested in that because they don't see it around them. There's nothing to focus on anymore.
But Nabil wasn't pessimistic because he said it's all with people now, and it'll all be released in due course. It'll all start, it'll come back. You don't agree?
I don't know. I don't think it will. I really doubt it.
Because people aren't making it anymore.
Well, they're making it, but then it's not
It's
the same.
true. It's utterly.
They had television. They had no television. They had no education. They had nothing else to do except make beautiful stuff. And now there's too much going on. There are wars all over the place. Things get destroyed. People, have televisions now. They have internet and everything else. And then
I know I've got one little carpet that has a soldier woven into it, and many of the Afghani carpets have war themes because there has been war for so long.
I would never buy them. I was appalled by. I mean, they were amazing, and a lot of people do collect them, but I never bought any. I
what about the market? Is there actually a market for this stuff now? The younger generation are not buying ethnographic art to decorate their homes or whatever. At least this is what I've heard from other dealers.
You're absolutely right. They're not.
This is true. David and I both belong to the Textile Museum Associates in Los Angeles. In Southern California, we have, we're sort of the last of the collectors, and nobody's kids in our group are interested in even inheriting their parents' ethnographic materials. They don't have the time or the money to, or the interest to learn about them, you know, and so that era has unfortunately, for the moment, passed. Absolutely. And many of the dealers, the Istanbul dealers, say, "Oh, but it'll come back," but not in our lifetimes. I
don't think so. And that's why it's so nice that Ali is doing it, because
yes, exactly,
the dealer. Yeah, and I'm very lucky I have Alexander who's interested as my son.
Yeah, he has it's a hard time for him to find a market now, you know, because people are not buying, and this COVID is not going to help. It's going to devastate a lot of the. You know, the travelers and the buyers, both.
Well, yeah, but there's nothing to find traveling anymore.
That's right.
Even just for traveling's sake.
If I might present a contrarian point of view, when I follow the textile auctions, not thoroughly, but somewhat, because I like old Kashmiri shawls, I must say if something good comes up on auction, it still commands a very good price. So there are people looking, there are people buying. And to Julian's point, yes, it's sad that these things are not in their native countries anymore, but it's also comforting to know that the greatest things that left are probably being very well looked after.
Well,
and are at least safe.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that I don't follow the broad textile market, but I do follow the carpet market. And what you're seeing now is what you've seen reasonably, that the very top pieces. But when I say top pieces, I'm talking 0.5%. We're not talking 5%. For example, there was the French are notoriously bad at cataloging art. And you brought up Holly. So Holly sent out, we've been subscribers since the beginning. And I actually gave an entire collection of Holly magazines, including the first one, to Southern Illinois, Indiana University for their special collections. However, so in the last Holly newsletter, which came out this week, you'll notice a write-up of an auction that took place in Rouen, France, and they are notoriously bad at cataloging. And what came, and you can see that some very, very important carpets, the most beautiful I have ever seen, and even the reviewer said, of a 15th century Holbein pattern carpet, 15th century. It brought 165,000 euros.
Wow.
Okay, now that piece 10 or 15 years ago would have brought 350,000 euros. So I mean, it is really a spectacular carpet, and it was cataloged for 5,000 to 10,000. But of course, the room was packed with dealers who knew exactly what it was. But even so, it did not bring the one collection, the Chris Alexander collection of early tribal carpet, mostly fragments, was a spectacular. And he had published this. It was a spectacular auction in London. Bought, I might add, in large measure, except for one or two things, by a modern painting dealer. And he managed to get a collection of carpet fragments, because most of his pieces were fragments, but large fragments, to corral this whole collection for maybe $500,000 or $600,000, which didn't even pay the taxes on some of the paintings that this man actually sells.
Wow.
So, and someone told him that this is an important collection that came up. So yes, you're seeing money for textiles, but only the tiny
top. Always the top of anything will always sell. But I'm much more interested in the other stuff, not the top pieces. I don't want just to deal with museums and things. I like just you know, what people made, the ethnographic value of it. I mean, and they had incredible beauty as well. I mean, it was very lovely, but they weren't the top pieces.
Cashmere shawls right now are very collectible, but things go in cycles. So the last, whatever, Christie's or Sotheby's had a huge prices for cashmere shawls.
Yeah.
The rest of it is down, way down.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good to know because I have some.
I think shawls are an anomaly because especially Indian women, whether they're living overseas or in India, you know, they've seen their mothers and grandmothers wear them. They know what they are. It's very interesting that antique Kashmiri shawls will sell for much more in India than they will in this country. Yeah, because people don't know what they are here. And so they're almost, I would say, half to a third of the price in the US than what people pay for them in India.
Mm-hmm. I remember going to an auction just before going to India once and buying one for £28 and thought, I'm nuts, I'm going to India. And then I saw the prices there. So I have sold them in India.
And there are still many dowry closets, trunks all over India that have not been opened yet. And one of my friends, his mother hasn't opened the closet, so to speak. And I said, when she does, I'll be on the next flight. Because I can't imagine what is in there.
Oh, Barbara, but the bad news is in India's climate, if you haven't seen it in a while, it's probably destroyed.
Well, eaten.
It's not going to survive the humidity and the bugs and all of that.
True. But it's still a wonderful fantasy.
Hang on to the fantasy, Barbara, because it might be a while before you get on that plane.
I know. Pip, I have to thank you for the pictures, especially because I was back there, and Afghanistan was a moment in time that there is no way to describe, that probably marked my personal aesthetic excitement and textile and ethnographic, and crossing Afghanistan, you know, and the camel caravan and the coochies. It was like, I'm a nice Jewish girl from Evanston. How did I get here? And my parents were appalled, and yet I had said yes. And most of the astonishing things in my life have always been because I said yes. And you're describing saying yes. And I think everyone in this room has a particular version of what the word yes released for all of us.
Pru on.
Pip, thank you. Alexander, thank you.
Thank you. Really
Thank you
enjoyed
very
that.
much.
Thank you, Barbara, for organizing it. Alexander, the relationship between you and your mom and the way you spoke to each other is so lucky. And I'm green with envy that my mother was the one who would say no, not yes. That I didn't have a mother to take me to India when I was, or Afghanistan when I was a kid.
My parents were appalled.
Barbara, when my first trip to India, my parents were already gone, but I had an aunt, my mother's older sister, who went and got a flyer from Devon Avenue and brought it to me and said, you don't need to go that far away.
But then there was, my mother said to me, and you know, my early 20s were a time of the basic black dress. And I had come back, I think, from Afghanistan, and I'm in my little black dress going out with mom and dad. And mother looked at me, she says, you absolutely confuse our friends because you look so normal. And it was kind of camouflage was wonderful. I only blossomed into hippie and boho because now I know what I'm looking at, and I have a Pip to supply me in a gorgeous robe. I only vaguely knew about these things. It never occurred to me I could wear them. You know, I was in camouflage. I was in the little black dress or the business suit. And then I wasn't.
No, I never got to the business suit.
I can see.
Lucky you.
I was a beatnik.
No, I couldn't show up with the publishers looking like I do now. You know, you had to wear the uniform.
Well, I was unemployable.
Your friend Hopkirk, I love his books, all of them.
Oh, isn't it oh, yes, yes,
Not
yes.
just Foreign Devils, but The Great Game, all of it, just fantastic, Rhoda.
Yeah. And he sold all his collection, and he gave me a lot of his collection of textiles and of jewelry.
And what happened to his library? Because that was being
His library took 2 days at Sotheby's. It sold.
Wow.
It all sold. Yeah.
It wasn't.
What a book that is.
It was broken up a bit. The collection, the library.
The library was broken up. It was all sold.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious about the languages you spoke in Afghanistan. Clearly, you weren't doing business in English.
I was.
You were?
I mean,
Really?
I learned Latin. I wasn't like Andy. Oh, yes. Oh, they all knew. They were, they were into
Oh, yes.
Really? Even in the 70s?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
They knew.
interesting. Wow.
Anyone in the world who wants to sell you anything speaks English.
Mm-hmm.
And did 30 and 40 years ago, 50 years ago?
They spoke English, absolutely.
Mhm.
Amazing. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
And were you getting as change where they'd break off the calf and give it to you if they didn't have, if it was too small amount to give you a bill or a coin?
They tore up a note?
No, I think you were dealing with quite a significant amount of money at that time. I mean,
Well, I wasn't. I was buying a vegetable.
I was being fed.
Even better.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. It's really.
Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Pip,
Really, come and visit me.
Please, can we? That would be
Absolutely.
we'll do a field trip when we can.
When we
You're only up
can.
the road from me. You have to come to me as well.
Yeah, well, I'm sleeping under your table. You know, Betty was saying, I don't think he has room. I said, under a table, yes. And that gorgeous tea, is that a holiday tradition?
It is.
Oh,
You haven't lived till you've tasted Julian's plum pudding with a whole clementine baked into the middle.
Ooh. Ooh.
That's not fair.
we'll be there.
Yeah, we're coming.
Good.
Thank you,
Bye,
Barbara.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you,
Thank
thank
you,
you, thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.